The first slap of rain hit the ballroom windows the same second Celeste Marrow's wine glass slipped out of her hand and shattered against the marble, and I was already moving before anyone else understood what they were looking at. "Someone catch her," a man said, uselessly, from 3 feet away, doing nothing with his hands but adjusting his cufflinks. I was not close enough. I ran anyway. 200 guests in silk and tailored wool parted around me like I was contagious, which, in a sense, in that house, I had always been. Celeste's knees buckled before I reached her, and I went down onto broken glass to catch her skull before it met the floor, my palm already counting her pulse before my brain had finished catching up to my body. Weak. Too fast. Skin gone the color of skimmed milk. "She's seizing," I said. To no one. To everyone. "Someone call for oxygen and get me space." Nobody moved. Nobody in that room had ever once looked at me like I was capable of anything except carrying trays and disappearing, and for 3 years, that was exactly the life I had built for myself. Small and quiet and beneath anyone's notice. But my hands did not care what the room thought of me. My hands remembered a decade of triage tents and traffic accidents and men bleeding out on gurneys, and they went to work without asking my permission. I tore the seam of her sleeve to find a vein. I turned her head to keep her airway clear. And I was still counting her pulse under my fingers, out loud, calm, clinical, when a shadow fell over both of us that smelled like salt cedar and struck flint, a scent I had not let myself breathe in for 3 years, because I could not survive breathing it in and losing it twice. I did not look up. I could not look up. Not yet. Before I tell you what happened when I finally did, you should know this, because the middle of a story like mine is easier to survive if you already know somebody is rooting for you. So if you want to see where this goes, go ahead and subscribe to the channel now, and I'll take you the rest of the way. My name is Ren Calder, and 3 years before that ballroom floor, I had been a wife. Not the kind of wife who gets remembered at dinner parties, the kind who gets erased from them. I had trained as a field medic in places most people in that ballroom couldn't have found on a map, patched up strangers in the backs of trucks with my bare hands and a headlamp. And then I had come home from all of that and married a woman everyone told me was too cold to love anyone, least of all an Omega who mended things for a living instead of owning them. Rosalind Ashgrave. The papers called her the widow of Ashgrave Shipping, though she had never buried a spouse, only ever a mother, and, they liked to imply, a heart. I had married her anyway, in a courthouse with 2 witnesses and a paper ring, because we couldn't afford anything nicer yet, and for 11 months I had been, impossibly, the person she came home to. Then, I wasn't. A letter in my own handwriting, one I never wrote, ended it, and a letter in hers, one I never received, apparently ended it from her side too. I left with a duffel bag, and a number I never called again. I told myself it was pride. It was actually a wound with a scab too thin to survive being looked at. I had spent 3 years rebuilding myself into someone who didn't need looking at. A staffing agency, a rotation of quiet private clients, no permanent address, no photographs on the wall. When the agency called me at 6 that morning about an emergency placement, a client with a cardiac condition, discretion required, name withheld until arrival, I said yes, because saying yes to work was the only thing keeping my hands from shaking these days. And because the fee would cover the rent I was 3 weeks behind on. Nobody told me the estate belonged to Ashgrave Shipping. Nobody told me the name on my new client's file, Celeste Marrow, was the name the tabloids had already engaged to my ex-wife. I found out the way I found out everything important in my life. Badly, publicly, and on my knees on a marble floor with someone else's blood pressure crashing under my hands. The shadow that fell over us did not move. I felt her before I heard her, the way you feel weather change in your joints. Move, she said. Not a request. I need 30 more seconds, I said, without looking up, my hand still working. She's stabilizing. If you pull me off her, now she isn't. There was a silence with teeth in it. Then, get her an ambulance. Now, someone move these people back. Only when Celeste's pulse settled under my fingers into something survivable did I finally sit back on my heels and look up into the face I had spent 3 years teaching myself not to picture, and found it already staring down at me, with an expression I hadn't earned the right to name yet, somewhere between fury and disbelief, and something raw underneath both. "Ren," Rosalind said, like the word cost her something to spend. "Rosalind," I said back, and felt the whole room and the last 3 years tilt sideways at once. The paramedics arrived 4 minutes later to find Celeste breathing evenly, color returned, and a woman she'd never met kneeling in a torn silk dress covered in someone else's champagne, refusing to let go of her wrist until a stretcher confirmed she was steady enough to release. They asked who I was. Rosalind answered before I could. "My wife," she said. Then, before the room could finish absorbing that, colder, my estranged wife. "She'll be staying to monitor the patient." That was how I came to spend the next 6 weeks inside a house I had once dreamed of raising children in, tending to the health of the woman my father-in-law had chosen to replace me, under the command of the alpha who had once promised me forever, and then, apparently, changed her mind without telling me why. The estate sat on a headland above gray water, all glass and old stone, the kind of house that made you lower your voice without being told to. Dorothea Pike, Rosalind's second in command since before I'd met her, met me at the east door with a face like a closed fist. "You've got some nerve," she said. "I've got a patient," I said. "The nerve is optional." She studied me a long moment, the way you study a stray dog you aren't sure will bite. "Mrs. Pell will show you the medical wing. Don't wander, and don't," she added, quieter, almost involuntarily, "break her again." I didn't correct the assumption that I was the one who'd done the breaking. I was too tired and too unsure anymore which of us actually had. Agnes Pell, the housekeeper who had run that house since before Rosalind was born, was the only person in it who looked at me like I was still a person and not a headline. She fed me before she said a single word about the situation, a bowl of the same barley soup I remembered from the first winter Rosalind brought me home to meet her, and only once I'd finished did she say, gently, "You look thinner than you did as a bride." "I've had a busy 3 years. So has she," Agnes said, and left it there the way people leave doors unlocked on purpose. Celeste Marrow turned out to be 26, sharp-tongued and dying by inches from a congenital heart defect that 3 specialists had already failed to name correctly. She also turned out to be infuriatingly kind. "You're the wife," she said the first night, while I checked the monitor beside her bed. "Was," I said. "Funny, nobody in this house talks about you in the past tense except you." She studied me over the rim of her water glass. She kept a room ready. "Did you know that?" "I found it by accident looking for a linen closet." "Your clothes are still in it. Your handwriting's still on a grocery list stuck to a mirror." I told myself that was staff gossip, the kind people invented to make a sad story more interesting. I did not let myself believe it until the second week, when I went looking for a spare blanket and found the room Celeste meant, untouched, dusted weekly, my reading glasses still on the nightstand exactly where I'd left them the morning I walked out, as if the house, at least, had never stopped waiting for me to come back and pick them up. I sat on the edge of that bed for a long time before I let myself cry, because I did not yet understand what I was crying about, and understanding it would take the rest of this story to earn. The wealth of that house announced itself the way wealth does when it's real instead of performed, not in gold trim but in the weight of the doors. the silence of the floors, the way staff deferred without being told to. My apartment across town had one window and a radiator that clanked. Here, my new temporary quarters had a private terrace facing the sea, which felt like an accusation more than a comfort. Rosalind had built an empire since I'd left her. Or maybe she'd already been building it the whole time, and I simply hadn't been looking. She avoided me for the first 4 days as thoroughly as a woman avoids a house fire. On the 5th, I found her standing in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, badly reheating the same barley soup Agnes had fed me, staring at the pot like it owed her an explanation. "You still don't know how to cook that," I said before I could stop myself. Her shoulders went rigid. She didn't turn around. "I never had to. You always did it. I'm not doing it now. I know." A long pause. Steam rising between us like a held breath. "I wasn't asking you to." I took the spoon from her hand anyway, because some instincts outlast anger, and fixed the heat before it scorched. She watched my hands the whole time like she was memorizing them for a test she'd already failed once. "Why are you really here, Ren?" she said finally. Not sentiment. An accusation dressed as a question. "Because your fiancé almost died in front of 200 witnesses, and I was the only person in the room whose hands weren't shaking. That's not what I asked. It's the only answer I have." She looked at me then. Really looked. The way she used to when we were newly married, and she couldn't quite believe I'd stayed the night. Then, something in her face closed like a fist. "Don't get comfortable in this house again," she said, and left the soup, and left me, standing in a kitchen that smelled like the first year of my marriage. The clue that cracked something open came 4 days later, delivered by Celeste herself, half-drugged on a sedative before a procedure, mumbling with the honesty-only exhaustion allows. "She has your letters," Celeste said, in the study. 3rd drawer. I only know because I went looking for a pen. Her eyes fluttered shut, then open again. She reads them when she thinks no one's watching. I've seen her. Why would a woman who left you keep every letter you never sent her? I told myself it was the sedative talking. I went to the study anyway, at midnight, guilt and curiosity fighting the whole way there, and found the drawer unlocked, as if it had never once needed a lock, because no one else in that house would have dared. Inside were 11 letters. My handwriting, dates from the month I left. Words I had written and burned in a metal wastebasket the night I packed my bag, certain no one would ever read them because I had made sure they didn't exist. Except here they were. Not burned. Not mine to have burned, apparently, because these were copies, forgeries, good enough to fool a grieving woman, written in a hand trained expertly to mimic mine, saying things I had never said. That I'd taken a payment. That I'd never loved her, only her name. That leaving had been easy. Beneath them, a second stack. Letters in Rosalind's hand, addressed to me, postmarked 3 years ago, never delivered, returned unopened with a stamp reading address, unknown, though I had never once moved. I sat on that study floor with both stacks of lies in my lap and felt the last 3 years of my life fold sideways into a shape I didn't recognize. Every letter I wrote her, she never got. Every letter she wrote me, I never got either. Someone had built our ending with their own hands, and neither of us had written a single true word of it. I did not sleep that night. I sat with those letters until dawn turned the sea outside gray, then gold, and by the time Agnes found me there, she took one look at my face and said only, "You found them," like she'd been waiting 3 years for someone else to. "Who wrote the fake ones?" I asked her. Agnes's mouth went thin and careful, the particular carefulness of a woman who has kept a secret so long it has fused to her bones. "Ask her father," she said. "Ask him why he insisted on handling all the household correspondence that spring. Ask him why he was so certain the marriage wouldn't survive the merger he needed her free to make. Augustus Ashgrave. I had met him exactly 4 times in 11 months of marriage, and every time he had looked at me like an accountant discovering an error in a column that should have balanced. I found him in the East drawing room that same morning, drinking coffee like a man with nothing to fear, and I set both stacks of letters on the table between us, without a word. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he looked at me and smiled, the particular smile of a man who has never once been made to answer for anything. "You always were good with your hands," he said. "Pity you're less good at knowing when to use them and when to walk away. You forged my handwriting. I preserved my company," he said, unbothered, as if the two were the same sentence. Rosalind was going to bankrupt 11 years of family strategy over a nurse with a pretty jaw and no last name worth marrying into. "I fixed a problem. You should be thanking me. You got 3 peaceful years instead of a marriage to a woman who was never going to choose you over this house anyway." "She's choosing this house right now because she thinks I abandoned her," I said. "That was never a choice she made freely. You made it for both of us." He set down his coffee, unhurried. "Prove it then," he said, and there was something underneath the calm that told me he did not for 1 second believe I could. I did not know yet that I would. I only knew, standing there, that the storm rolling in off the water that evening was going to be the least of what was about to break loose in that house, and that some truths, once found, refused to stay quiet just because the powerful person who buried them would prefer otherwise. The storm that night knocked out power to the whole headland by 9, and by 10 Celeste's monitor had gone silent in the dark, which for a woman with her heart meant one thing, and meant it fast. I found her by the light of my phone, arrhythmia climbing past anything her medication could hold, and I did the only thing a decade of field triage had ever taught me to do in a house, with no backup generator and an ambulance 40 minutes out through flooded roads. I got my hands on her chest, and I did not let go. "Talk to me," I told her, counting compressions under my breath. "Stay talking, stay with me, tell me anything." Rosalind arrived with a lantern and Dorothea behind her, and for one terrible, suspended second I watched her face try to decide whether the woman on the floor fighting to save her fiancé's life was the same woman her father's letters had told her never to trust again. "Help me hold her steady," I said, because there was no time to fight for anyone's belief, only for Celeste's pulse. Rosalind knelt without another word and did exactly what I told her, her hands following mine the way they used to in our first year together, before either of us had learned what silence could cost. Celeste came back on the 4th cycle, gasping, terrified, alive, in the lantern light afterward. Rosalind's hands were shaking for the first time I had ever seen them shake, and she looked at me with an expression that had nothing left of accusation in it. "You saved her," she said. "I would have saved anyone in that room tonight," I said. "That's not what you actually want to ask me." "Then ask it for me." "Did you ever stop loving me?" I said. "Or did somebody just make very sure neither of us could tell?" She didn't answer with words. She answered by reaching across Celeste's unconscious body and taking my hand, hard enough to hurt, like she needed proof I was solid enough to survive, holding on to twice. "Tell me to stop," she said quietly, "and I will." "Don't stop," I said, and that was the whole of the truth either of us needed that night, though the storm outside gave us exactly 4 more minutes of privacy before Celeste's eyes fluttered open and the world came rushing back in. We did not kiss that night. We were too raw, and Celeste needed both of us functioning. But something between us had cracked open that would not close again, no matter how hard either of us tried to argue ourselves out of it by morning light. The days that followed were quiet in the particular way houses go quiet after a storm, everyone a little tender, a little careful with each other. Rosalind found reasons to be in rooms I was already in. I found reasons to let her. We didn't talk about the letters yet. We talked instead about smaller, safer things. The soup, the sea, the garden Agnes had let go wild since I'd left. A boathouse door at the edge of the property that had rusted shut sometime in the last 3 years and that Rosalind, inexplicably, had never had repaired. I kept meaning to fix it, she admitted one evening, both of us sitting on the terrace steps with tea going cold between us. I never did. I think some part of me didn't want anyone opening it who wasn't you. Why that door? Because it's where I asked you to marry me, she said, like it was obvious, like I should have remembered, and I did remember, all at once, so completely my chest ached with it. That was the evening she told me about her mother. A woman who had raised her on a single doctrine, control is survival, want nothing you cannot afford to lose, and had died believing it, alone, in a house full of staff, and no one who loved her enough to sit with her at the end. I thought loving you the way I did made me weak, Rosalind said. My father let me believe leaving you had proven him right. It took losing you completely to understand the opposite was true. Control never kept my mother safe. It just kept her lonely until it killed her. You're not her, I said. I'm trying not to be. She looked at me sideways, careful, like a woman testing ice. It would help if you were still here to remind me. I told her about the years since, the shelters, the cot in a room I shared with 3 strangers the first winter, the way I'd stopped answering when people asked if I was married because the truth felt too complicated to survive out loud. I told her about the letters I'd burned, thinking they were mine to grieve alone. I never sent a single one of those words, I said. Whatever you read in that drawer wasn't me. I know that now, she said. I think some part of me always suspected it and was too proud to chase the suspicion. I let my father's certainty be easier than my own doubt. That's on me, not just on him. It was Celeste, 3 days later, steadier now, walking the garden on my arm while Rosalind took a call inside, who said the thing none of us had said yet out loud. I'm not marrying her, Celeste said, simply, watching a heron pick its way along the shoreline. I never really was, not in any way that mattered to either of us. It was always my father's ambition and hers, dressed up as ours. I like her. I might even love her a little, the way you love a good friend who saved your life twice in 1 week. But I've watched the way she looks at you since the storm, and I am not interested in spending the rest of my life competing with a ghost who turned out to be alive the whole time. You deserve better than being anyone's arrangement, I told her. So do you, Celeste said, and squeezed my arm, and for the first time since I'd arrived in that house, I let myself believe that maybe, impossibly, this could end without anyone I'd come to care about getting hurt. We should have known better than to relax. Houses like that one do not let go of their secrets that easily, and men like Augustus Ashgrove do not lose a hand of cards without playing his last one. The warmth lasted exactly 1 week. Then, Augustus called an emergency board meeting, and by the time Rosalind reached the boardroom, the story was already ahead of her. A story with my name at the center of it, twisted into something I did not recognize. The company's internal counsel had discovered, conveniently, that Celeste's poisoning at the gala matched a compound found in my old field medical kit, the one I'd kept since my triage years, the one that had been searched, apparently, sometime during the storm when everyone's attention was on saving Celeste's life instead of guarding my belongings. She's the outside nurse who reinserted herself into this family the same week the heir's fiancé was poisoned, Augustus told the board, his voice dripping with reluctant sorrow, the performance of a man forced to say a hard truth. I don't make this accusation lightly, but someone benefited from that collapse. Someone got back into this house because of it. By that evening, there were reporters outside the gate. By the next morning, there was a warrant, and 2 officers standing in the front hall while Dorothea argued with them and Rosalind stood frozen in a doorway, with an expression I had only ever seen on her once before, the day her mother died. The look of a woman watching control slip through fingers that had been trained never to let anything slip. "Rosalind," I said, as they put the restraints on my wrists, gentle but final, "look at me." "I didn't do this." "I know," she said, and her voice broke on the second word, and that was the worst image of the entire ordeal, not the handcuffs, not the flashing cameras at the gate, but Rosalind Ashgrave, the widow of Ashgrave Shipping, feared by boardrooms and press alike, standing perfectly still in her own front hall, unable to stop the thing happening to the one person she had only just gotten back. They took me to a holding cell that smelled like bleach and old coffee, and I sat on a bench and did the only thing I have ever known how to do when the world falls apart around me. I made myself useful. I asked for paper. I wrote out, from memory, the exact compound signature of every substance in my field kit, the ones I'd used for years, and the ones I hadn't touched since I left the last triage post I'd ever worked. I wrote out the toxicology markers a real lab would find in Celeste's blood if the compound truly matched mine. And beside it, the markers that would show up instead if the poison had actually been something slower, older, harder to trace, the kind used on livestock, the kind you'd find in a groundskeeper's shed, the kind Augustus Ashgrave's own estate had purchased in bulk 2 months before the gala, according to invoices I had glimpsed once in that same unlocked study drawer and thought nothing of at the time. I gave the paper to the one officer who looked like she might still believe in something and asked her please to get it to Dorothea Pike, and hoped that loyalty, once it finally turns hard. It did. Dorothea took my notes to an independent lab that same night, paid for out of her own pocket, because Ashgrave Shipping's accounts were, at that moment, entirely under Augustus's signature. The results came back at 4 a.m. The poison in Celeste's system was not a compound I had ever carried. It was rodenticide, industrial grade. The exact batch purchased for the estate's grounds 2 months prior, requisitioned and signed for by one person. Rosalind did not wait for daylight. She went to her father's house at 5 a.m. with Dorothea, the lab report, and every ledger the company's real accountant could produce, once someone finally asked her to look, without Augustus standing over her shoulder. "You poisoned your son's fiancé," Rosalind said, "to collapse a merger you'd already decided wasn't worth the money once you found a better one, and you let my wife take the fall for it, because you have never once in your life paid for a mistake yourself." "Careful," Augustus said. "Accusations like that end companies." "Good," Rosalind said. "This one's ending anyway." "It's ending under my name, not yours, and it's ending with the truth in it for once." He lunged for the ledger. Dorothea was faster, and older instincts than boardroom manners took over fast enough that it was Rosalind's forearm that caught the edge of a thrown decanter meant for the papers, glass biting deep enough to need stitches later. Blood running down to her wrist while she never once let go of the evidence in her other hand. "Now we're even," she told me later, showing me the stitches with something almost like a smile for the letters. "You bled proving your case. Now I have too. I could have let her take him apart completely." Every part of me that had spent 3 years grieving a version of my own life he'd stolen wanted to, but mercy, in the end, is the thing I have always been better at than winning, and I found myself, of all people, asking her to stop short of the edge. Ruin the lie, I told her, not the man beyond what the law requires. Let a court do what you don't need to carry yourself. She listened. It cost her nothing that mattered to listen, and it kept her, I think, from becoming the very thing her mother's doctrine had almost made of her. The press conference happened 6 days later, in the same ballroom where all of it had started, only this time the chandeliers were on for a different kind of spectacle. Rosalind stood at a podium with the toxicology report, the requisition forms, and Dorothea's sworn statement, and read every piece of it aloud to a room full of the same people who had once watched me kneel on their marble floor and done nothing. My father poisoned a young woman under my protection, she said, and let my wife, whom I had wrongly believed abandoned me, be arrested for his crime. I have the evidence here for anyone who wants to see it. I have already given a copy to the district attorney. She let the silence hold a moment before she added, quieter, but into a microphone that carried it to the very back row. I also owe a public apology to Ren Calder, who never once, in 3 years, or in this crisis, stopped being the most honest person in my life. I was the one who stopped believing it. The room that had never once looked at me twice now could not look away. Augustus Ashgrave was arrested that afternoon, on the same marble I'd once bled on to trying to save someone he'd poisoned for profit, and this time it was his wrists that met the restraints, in full view of the same cameras he had once used to try to end me. Rosalind found me afterward in the garden, by the boathouse door she'd never fixed, and got down on one knee in the wet grass without a single word of preamble. I already married you once, she said, and I let someone talk me out of believing it mattered. I'm not doing that twice. Tell me to stop, and I will. Don't stop, I said, and this time there was no storm to interrupt us, no monitor beeping in another room, only the sea and the smell of salt cedar and struck flint folding around me like the safest kind of weather. She kissed me there in the wet grass in front of a door that had been rusted shut for 3 years, and when we finally pulled back to breathe, the old latch, jostled loose by nothing more than her shoulder against the frame, gave way at last with a groan and swung open onto a boathouse that still, impossibly, held the 2 folding chairs we'd once sat in the night she first asked me to be hers. We rebonded on a Tuesday in October, in that same garden, with Agnes Pell weeping openly into a dish towel and Dorothea standing at attention like she was guarding a president instead of watching 2 women renew a bite mark on a throat. Celeste stood beside Rosalind as her witness, not her rival, in a green dress she chose herself, and when the officiant asked if anyone present had cause to object, she said, loudly enough for the whole garden to hear, none. I've never been so relieved to lose a fiancé in my life, and the laughter that followed cracked something loose in that garden that had needed cracking for years. In 11 years working for this family, Dorothea said later, raising a glass with a stiffness that didn't quite hide how much the words cost her, I have never once seen her wait for anyone the way she waited for you. I didn't think she had it in her. I'm glad I was wrong. 6 months on, Ashgrave Shipping ran under new leadership structures Rosalind had rebuilt from the ground up, with Augustus serving the first of a 14-year sentence for fraud, attempted poisoning, and obstruction, and with every forged letter entered as evidence at trial, read aloud in a courtroom until the lie could never again pretend to be true. Celeste moved into a research fellowship studying the very heart condition that had almost killed her, funded by a foundation Rosalind quietly endowed, and never once mentioned in public, because some kindnesses do their best work unannounced. A year on, Ren Calder moved back into the room with the reading glasses still on the nightstand, only now the closet held her clothes on purpose, hung there by her own hands, chosen to stay. The boathouse door never stuck again, Agnes kept making the barley soup, and Rosalind, after 11 attempts and several small kitchen fires, finally learned to make it herself, badly, and served it anyway, because I had told her once that the trying mattered more than the recipe, and she had, at last, believed me. On the morning this story closes, the sea outside that headland was doing the thing it does at low tide in early autumn, turning the color of struck flint under a sky the color of warm sugar. And two women stood at a boathouse door that no longer needed forcing, one omega and one alpha, 3 years and one buried lie behind them, with nothing left between them anymore but the truth, finally spoken all the way through. It is a strange, particular grace, being lost and then being found by the exact same person twice. Being seen the first time is a gift. Being seen again, after everything conspired to make sure you never would be, is closer to a miracle. Love, it turns out, was never the thing either of us needed protecting from. It was the one thing worth staying for, once we finally stopped letting someone else write the ending for us. The end. If a story about a stolen love finding its way home again stayed with you tonight, that's exactly why this channel exists. To give women like Ren the ending they deserved all along, instead of the one someone else tried to force on them. If you want more nights like this one, go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. And I'd love to know, in the comments, which moment hit you hardest, the boathouse door finally opening, or the instant Rosalind chose the truth over her own father. Tell me which one, and why. Until the next story finds you, sleep well and remember, the right person never needed convincing to love you. They just needed the truth. Good night.